Under head coach Kirby Smart, the Georgia Bulldogs typically dominate, and they haven't left much margin for error. It's very common for Georgia to get off to an early lead and dominate most of the game, but in 2025, the Bulldogs have had a new identity. For example, they have a plethora of running backs and a plethora of wide receivers instead of one or two go-to guys. And honestly, the most notable part about Georgia this year is that they have been the comeback kids. There's been multiple times where you thought they were out of the game or were going to lose, but instead, Georgia pulled a rabbit out of the hat and won the game. The Bulldogs currently sit at number 5 in the nation with a 7-1 record and are 3rd in the SEC. And in today's video, I want to talk about this weird and bizarre season for Georgia. This feels very different from other years, and we're going to talk about the team, how the team has done this year, and how I think they're going to do the rest of the season. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's go ahead and get started and talk about Georgia football. Okay, so before we can talk about this year's team, I feel like we should go back to last season. Georgia ended up having a tremendous 2023 campaign, but they were left out of the college football playoff after losing to Alabama in the SEC championship. In 2024, Georgia was once again led by Carson Beck, who ended up throwing for 3,500 yards and 28 touchdowns last year. True freshman Nate Frazier led the way with 600 yards rushing, and junior, former Florida transfer Trevor Etienne led the team with 9 total touchdowns. Both Arian Smith and Dominic Leavitt were the go-to wide receivers, and this team was loaded top to bottom with talent. In terms of the NFL draft, they had 3 first-round picks in Malachi Starks, Jalen Walker, and Mykel Williams, a second-round pick in Tate Ratledge, 2 third-round picks in Dylan Fairchild and Jared Wilson, 2 fourth-round picks in Arian Smith and Trevor Etienne, and then in the last 3 rounds, you had Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, Smell Mondo Jr., Warren Brinson, Dan Jackson, and Dominic Lovett. Georgia had so much talent on last year's team, and their season was weird. They won their first 3 games before losing a crazy game against Alabama, or aka the Ryan Williams game, and this was a setback for them. But they would win their next 4 games, and none of them were really all that close. Georgia pulled away, including a huge victory over number 1 Texas, before they then lost 28-10 against Ole Miss. That felt like a fluke, and it's very rare that Georgia actually gets beat by a lot. To finish the season, they would upset number 7 Tennessee, beat UMass, and then survive that 8 overtime game with Georgia Tech. There was definitely some interesting stuff going on in that game, but they got to the SEC championship, where despite losing Carson Beck at halftime, they would beat number 2 Texas and win the SEC and go to the college football playoff, just like everyone had predicted. But unfortunately, first-time starter Gunnar Stockton didn't have a great game against Notre Dame, and they lost 23-10. I'd say last year's team was weird because they had 2 games in which they got thoroughly beat, and the 2025 team is very different. Interestingly enough, I decided to type into Google and see what AI came up with for Georgia's preview. It read, quote, UGA football is predicted to be a top 5 team, likely making the college football playoff, but with a 10-2 regular season record and a second place finish in the SEC, predicted by some. Key factors for success include the development of new players, especially at quarterback with Gunnar Stockton, and a more adaptable offense. While facing a challenging schedule, which includes games against Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida, betting markets still favor them to win more than 9.5 games. Honestly, that was pretty interesting, and I never use AI for any of these videos or ever even look at it, but they have a chance to hit the nail on the head here. One of the biggest changes for Georgia this past offseason was moving into a new quarterback. This time, it would be Gunnar Stockton. They also had Ryan Montgomery, Ryan Puglisi, and Hezekiah Millender behind him, but everybody thought Georgia's quarterback room was a bit weak, despite what Gunnar Stockton was coming out of high school. Coming out of Raven County, Georgia, he was a 5-star at one point who flipped between South Carolina and Georgia, and this guy had some truly incredible high school stats. During his senior season, he had 4,100 yards and 55 touchdowns, while also having 15 more on the ground. In total, he had nearly 14,000 passing yards, 177 passing touchdowns, 4,400 rushing yards, and 77 rushing touchdowns. The term video game numbers gets thrown around a lot, but he actually had ridiculous numbers. So, in his first 2 seasons as a backup, he had about 500 yards and 3 total touchdowns, so there wasn't much starting experience. That was going to be new. In terms of the running back spot, Nate Frazier would end up returning, but they lost Trevor Etienne. They'd need a couple of other guys to step up, so they brought in Illinois transfer Josh McCray, and then Dwight Phillips Jr. and Chauncey Bowens were also going to get a chance to get more reps. You ended up losing 2 receivers in Dom Lovett and Arian Smith, so they replaced them with 2 more really good receivers in Zachariah Branch and Noah Thomas. Branch was a former 5-star, and Thomas was a guy at Texas A&M who, if he could properly develop, could be a superstar. Honestly, Noah Thomas hasn't had a great year this year, but Zachariah Branch is now the team's leading receiver by far. The defense lost tons of players to the portal, but they did return guys like CJ Allen, Raylan Wilson, KJ Bolden, Chris Cole, and then everyone was expecting Ellis Robinson to step up. So far, the Georgia defense is as good as advertised, and they are one of the most stable groups in the entire nation each and every year, and Glenn Schimann might get himself a new job here soon. So yeah, you're probably wondering, when are we going to start talking about this actual season? Well, that time is right now. Okay, so to start out the season, they'd face off with the Marshall Thundering Herd, who had a new coaching staff and a lot of new players. In that game, Gunnar Stockton ended up combining for 4 touchdowns, and Zachariah Branch also had a score as Georgia won 45-7. The number 5 Bulldogs will move up to number 4 going into week 2, but they struggled with Austin Peay. They're one of the better teams in the OVC and the FCS, but the Bulldogs only won 28-6, and that was much closer than people expected. That's why going into week 3 against Tennessee, many thought that maybe they could get upset by the Vols. The Volunteers are ranked number 15 and led by Joey Aguilar and Chris Brazel, and this game was a classic. Tennessee actually ended up taking a 21-7 lead, and Georgia would have to fight back. That's exactly what they would do, as they would have 4 consecutive scoring drives in which they finally took a 27-21 lead, but then Tennessee ended up scoring 2 touchdowns in the last 16 minutes of action to take a 35-30 lead. Tennessee also ended up having a field goal, and all of a sudden, they were up 38-30. Georgia would be completely tested in this one, and Gunnar Stockton proved that he was legit, as he would lead his team down the field and eventually find London Humphreys for a 28-yard touchdown. Zachariah Branch caught the 2-point conversion, and it was tied at 38. Tennessee ended up pulling off some complete nonsense in the last few minutes, as they would try to drain the clock and have a game-winning field goal, but he ended up hooking it, and it was terrible. After making a field goal early on, Georgia would just have to score a touchdown, and Illinois transfer Josh McCray eventually had a 1-yard run, which gave them a 44-41 victory. That was the first moment of the comeback kids. After that, the number 17 Alabama Crimson Tide would come into Sanford Stadium and somehow beat the Bulldogs. Kirby does not typically lose at home, but after getting down 14-0, Georgia would have to fight back. Gunnar Stockton found Colby Young, but after an Alabama field goal, they were down 17-7. The game was 21-14 at halftime, and the only thing that happened in the second half was a Georgia touchdown, and the comeback would end up falling short as they would lose 24-21, and this was very uncommon for a Kirby Smart-led team. Would the Bulldogs fall apart, or would they bounce back? Well, it's been the latter. The following weekend, they would end up dismantling Kentucky 35-14 at home, as it wasn't a perfect performance, but it definitely was a bounce back. They would then face off with their rival Auburn, and that game was also weird. Auburn would take a 10-0 lead, then they didn't score the rest of the game, as Georgia had 2 field goals and 2 touchdowns to go on a 20-0 run, beating Auburn 20-10. I didn't personally get a chance to watch the game, but I've heard a lot of complaining about the officials, and how there was a lot of nonsense in that one. So if you did watch that game, let me know down below what actually happened in that one. Either way, this was the second comeback for Georgia, and since then, it has just continued. Number 5 Ole Miss would come to town, and after winning last year, Georgia was not going to let that happen again. This game was extremely entertaining, as at first it went back and forth a lot, but eventually Ole Miss would take a 35-26 lead, and they would have to pull off another comeback again. In the fourth quarter, Georgia would score 2 touchdowns and a field goal, and they would eventually win 43-35 after stopping the Rebels. This was a huge game for them, as Gunnar Stockton ended up throwing for nearly 300 yards and 4 touchdowns, and 3 of those went to tight end Lawson Lucky. Georgia had now pulled off a 3rd straight comeback, and it happened again this past weekend against Florida. The Gators are now working with an interim head coach, and honestly I did not think it would be close, but it was. Florida would eventually take a 10-7 lead, and then after going back and forth, Florida would take a 20-17 lead in the fourth quarter. Georgia would once again have to come back, and Chauncey Bowens had a 36-yard touchdown run. They ended up going up 24-20, and on a potential game-winning drive for Florida, they had a controversial call where they ruled it not a catch, and then they missed it on 4th down. Georgia went down the field, Florida shot themselves in the foot with an offsides call, and that was basically the game. The Bulldogs would end up winning 24-20, and this was now their 4th comeback win of the season. At this point, you could say they're lucky, they're good, or they're just well coached, but I think it's personally all 3. On the season, the Dogs are currently 7-1, 3rd in the SEC, and ranked 5th in the country. And Gunnar Stockton has taken the next step, as he's thrown for 1,776 yards and 12 touchdowns with only 2 picks, and he's also ran for 290 yards and 7 touchdowns. Chauncey Bowens, Nate Frazier, and Dwight Phillips Jr. are the 3 running backs, and then in terms of the receiving game, Zachariah Branch leads the way with 45 catches for 474 yards and 2 touchdowns, and then London Humphreys has 2, Lawson Lucky has 3, and Dylan Bell and Colby Young also catch passes for them. On the defensive side of the ball, Ellis Robinson leads the way with 2 interceptions. CJ Allen has 39 solo tackles. Him and Chris Cole each have 3 sacks apiece. And then Dalen Everett and Ellis Robinson each have 4 pass deflections. Georgia's once again playing really good football, and they are very well rounded, and this time they've got some luck on their side. For their last 4 games, they are definitely going to need it, as they'll face off at Mississippi State this upcoming Saturday. And while I don't think the Bulldogs will win, I think it'll be tougher than anticipated. It kind of has a trap game feel. After that, they'll face off with number 13 Texas in prime time, and I think Georgia wins that game pretty easily, as I think Texas is still pretty overrated. And then from there, they'll finish off against Charlotte, and then the biggest game will come against Georgia Tech, as that'll be a rivalry matchup on a neutral site in Atlanta. Had the Yellow Jackets not lost last weekend, this game would have been even bigger and could have been a top 5 matchup, but instead Georgia Tech blew it to NC State, so that game's fallen off a bit. But I do anticipate Georgia winning all 4 of these games. I think Georgia Tech has the best chance of upsetting them. Texas may talent-wise have the best chance at upsetting them, and then they should beat Charlotte and Mississippi State. But what do you guys think? If you're a Georgia fan, how have you guys pulled off all these comeback wins? How do you think the season will finish? And what other team or topic should I cover next? Be sure to let me know down below. Leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out one of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.